Welcome to a new video from Just Enough series. In this video, we'll discuss state management in front-end applications, and we will discuss the concepts behind the state and how it is being managed, whether it's local, shared, derived, and how to apply changes on the state, whether it's sync or async. And in this video, we'll only discuss the concepts behind state management, but we will not discuss any coding. So we will not get into details on how to use state, whether it's in React, Vue, Angular, Svelte, whatever the frameworks that you would like to use, but rather focus more on the concepts. And in a future video, we will have an application and we will build these we will use these concepts to build the state inside this application. And this is the application that we are going to build in the future. But in this video, we will use it only for like instruction and how to give sampling for where is the state and how it is being used in different parts of the application. But in this video, we will not discuss any coding. So the promise of this video is that you, at the end, you will be able to understand how to write better states and how to have better concepts where to store the state in different parts of the application and to name like different parts of these states. So let's start in this video by describing the first part, which is the state. And when we speak about the state is just a status or the current state of a single part of the application. Like for example, when we go to our application here, we see like this like button. When I click on it, there is liked. So when I scroll or do any other actions, the state is still the same. So the idea of a state is that it defines a certain component or a certain DOM in this case, but it shouldn't be only DOM, but rather maybe data as well. So it defines a certain definition of the components that we have in our UI. It defines the status of it at a certain instance, or you could think of it like a certain part of time. So it defines the current state of the components that we are dealing with. And the state could be separated into two parts, whether it's local or it is shared. But let's start by the idea of local state. So a local state is that the state is only for this component, but there also, like we know that components are not only like living it in on its own, but rather it's usually like it's either there is parent or a sibling component. So let's start by first the parent component. So the parent component also have a state or has a state. So for example, like this part of the application, which is have like the code and also the author, and it has the like button, so it also have a state for the author and the code and so on, and also there is a state for the like button as well. And we need also the state for the like button, because when we click on this one, we see like this admired thing that appears. So also this component or this container have the state for the is liked. So in this case, there is different states for the parent, but most importantly, it also has the state for the is liked. And as well, its child also have the state for the is liked. And usually what would happen like with junior developers, in this case, they would say, okay, I would store the is liked here and also is liked here, and would try to mirror or sync both of these states. And this contradicts the first property that we need to use for defining the state, which is single source of truth for a state. So whenever you find yourself like you're trying to mirror state in this case, be aware that there is something wrong. And in this case, we need to store the state in a single place, because it makes when we would like to debug states and so on, it makes it more manageable and it's easier to find bugs and so on. So the first part is to store the state in a single place, and we could store it, yeah, it's fine to store it inside the button, and when the state it changes, it fires an event outside and then change the state. When I say it like that, you think, okay, in this case, we have to store the state on the outside. And in this case, yes, in this case, we are not going to store the state in the child, but rather we need to find some way to make the state comes from the parent into the child. And in most UI frameworks, they call it props. And this is the first part. We in the concepts of states, we call it derived state, but let's adhere to some UI concept, and in this case we call it the props state. So when we move all of this just to clean everything, in this case, when we would like to store the is liked button, we have to store it in an upper container or the parent, and we pass it as a prop in this case. So it would become one of the props of the child. In this case, the child needs to be aware of I am is liked or not. And the source of truth is the is liked. So this is the first part. When we would like to move the state from the parent to the child, we would pass it as a prop. Now we know that state needs to be stored in a single place. The second part is how to change the state. So when we saw the state, it's already it's passing from the parent to the child, and then the state is inside this one. Of course, the state is not inside, but its usage is inside. And when we click on this button, in this case, we would like to change the state. When you think of it, you think of the state as a variable. In this case, people would, okay, I would just go to the state and change it, change the variable. And this is a problem because in this case, we, for example, somehow inside JavaScript, we have listener on this variable, using proxy or whatever constructor we are going to use. And we change the variable. Now we have this variable to become a two-directional way of changing the state, and this is contradicts the second most important property of a state, which is a single direction of a change. So in all ways of how to change the states, before having this modern frameworks, people would just go into this variable and it change it directly. And this makes it harder to debug further when we have a bigger application. But rather, the more cleaner way is to fire an event and let it delegate it to the main owner of the state. So in this case, we would fire an event from this button and send it to the parent, and then the parent would handle it, and then it changes state. And this is the second most important thing about state management, which is a single flow of a change. So in this case, we would have our state, and then there is the view that is viewing the state, which is, for example, our button, which is showing it's liked or not liked. And then when we would like to change the view, in this case, we would fire an action, and this action would go there and tell the state manager to change its state. And when the state is changed, it will send it back to the view and back again if you would like to change it. And in this case, this is the definition of a single flow of a change. So some junior developers, what they would usually do, they would, okay, I wouldn't know the idea of having the state in the outside and the inside, and there is a single truth. They would have also another state here, and they would mirror it somehow. So they would take the prop, yes, they would pass it as a prop, and then they would add, before sending to the component, they would have a watcher listening on this property, and then when this prop changes, they would change the state or the inner state of the component, because it is being used inside the button to show it change or not. And then they would have an event, and this event would, some developers would change the inner one and have another listener to change the one to the outside. Some other developers would have this event and then fire it back, and then when the parent listen to the state, they would change it back again and send it back as a prop, and there is a listener. So it's a little bit of a messy situation, so it is not correct. So whenever you find this pattern, in this case, when you find the pattern that you are storing state in two places, just move it into a single place. The second thing, when you find that the state is being not in a unidirectional of change, you would notice it as there is a state here. You would find there is a state. There should be always a state, and there is a view, and there is an action. If you didn't find this flow for managing the state, know that the state is not clean. In this case, you are not writing a cleaner code. And this SVA thingy is actually the MVC model that you know about. So in this case, we have the model, which is the state, and then we have the view, and then we have the controller, and the controller basically is firing an action inside this pattern. So this is how to change the state. and let's clean all of these things, and let's discuss the second part, which is the sibling. So this one, now we have discussed the parent basically on how to manage the state. Now we discuss it as a sibling. So if we go back to our example application, we see like these two components. We see this main container, which is stored like different codes, and there is a states or stats container, which stores how many liked components that already happened. And in this one, we need to store the state somewhere. So when we have like a sibling component, like another one here on the side, and we have a state inside this one because it stores like the status on how many things like. Some developers in this case would say, okay, let's add like an event here, and then it would, when the state for the button changes, like when the button is clicked, it would fire to the state of the container and then fire an action to the state. It's correct for the principle of a single flow direction, but it contradicts the like having a single source of state, because now we have like state here and also we are mirroring here as well. So in this case, this is contradicting the the first principle. And the easy solution is to move the state to an upper container. So they would have like an upper container here from the outside, and in this one they would store the state, and then they would send like this component to send the state here and send the state here as well. And in this case we have we have now a unidirectional as well, because the button, when it is fired, it would fire an action, send it to the parent, and then the parent would fire the action to the parent container, and it would change the state and then send it back to either this container or this container. And now we are adhering to the two principles of how to have a clean state. But this parent thingy, it doesn't have any view. So in this case, it would become only a way to manage the state. And we call this thing a store in like most terms. Sometimes they call it service, sometimes they call it store, but let's adhere with the front-end concept, which is a store. So the idea of a store, it's a place where we store the state, and always the store would provide two things. It would provide a way to access the inner state and also a way to change the state, and it would provide it to everyone. So this container would take like the way to change the state and also a way to read the state, and also this status thing would also find a way to read and change. So there would be like an external state here for like in the outside, and then both of these are listening to them. So now we discussed the local and shared state. Now we discuss the third concept, which is derived state. So the idea of a derived state is that we have a place where it stores states, and then we would like to have another form of the state. For example, we have like I would like this status for like this stats for counting how many like buttons. In this case, it would be multiplied by 2 or like multiplied by 3. I would like to show like a fake number. And instead of showing like 4 liked, I would like to show more liked things. So in this case, developers in this case would say, okay, let's have a state here because this is like a different state. And in this case, when the store changes the state, we will just mirror the state. Again, we will mirror like listen on the state changes, and when the state changes, we just like set state or like data in view, for example, and we would change the inner state as well. So in this case, we have like this one, this would become multiplied by 2, for example, and this is the state that is coming from the prop from the store. And now we find that we are somehow contradicting the first principle, which is a single place of truth for the state, because now it's like in two places. And that's where we have the concept of derived state. The idea of a derived state is just like a function. So if you remember from math class, you have like a function and then it returns something. So we have in this case like multiplied, like x multiplied by 2. And this is the main state basically. And then we do certain equation. And this derived state, or the function that is used for derived state, it always have to be like a functional method. Basically, it doesn't do any side effects, just to have it cleaner, so it's easier to debug in the future. So in this case, instead of having like another state inside this one, you will just remove it. And in this case, we add like a function here, and this function or inside the code would change it. So it multiplies by 2, or maybe it is not by 2. Maybe when we would like to, for example, like maybe another example, when the number of likes is more than 10, we would like the background for this stats to be like blue, for example, or green. So this is also an example for derived state. Like some developers would store this state as the color, and then when it changes, they listen on it. This is not correct. In this case, we drive it as well. So whenever there is a source, like if you would like to detect, okay, I'm using it correctly or not, like do I need these two states or not? Most of the time, you only need a single source, and you need a computed or like a way to drive the state. So it could be like coloring, or for example, there is like a certain information that needs to be shown here under like that shows, hey, you have increased the number of like you are liking more than 5 per day. You cannot like more than this. So in this case, we would have here a computed function that I don't want to say like listened, but basically computed the other states that we would like to see in our system. And this is the third concept, which is computed in this case, or we call it derived as well. And it exists in every framework because it's just like a function. You take the state and apply certain functions over it. Okay, now after we have discussed the computed or the derived state, let's discuss how to change the state, which is like whether it's like async or sync. And most of the time when you are going to change a state, it's sync, not async. So what happens? For example, let's go to React. In React, you have use effect. And some developers in this case would write, okay, I would like to, when I click on this button, I would like to change the inner state, which you would, when you see it, you would know, okay, this is not correct. After we discuss the idea of having a single source of truth. But inside the code, when you see it, you would notice, okay, we have like use effect, and we have like an inner state, and we have use effect listening on this inner state. When it changes, it does like a certain action or send a set state to the outside. In this case, you would see, okay, this is not a clean code. And whenever you are doing things like this, know that, okay, use effect is not in the right place. And use effect is one of the methods that are used to do async state changes. What is an example for this? An example for this, you are doing API calls, and you are, for example, like fetching some list from the backend or doing some changes, and then you have a promise, and inside the promise you would change the state. So you would have like set state, or for Vue you are directly changing the inner state, and also in Angular as well you are changing the inner state directly. Another example, also dealing with local storage or cookies or whatever, anything that is outside of your control, and there is some things of async happening, also timeout as well. All of this are valid point to use the async state changes, because you are invoking an action or doing a method or something, and then it is sent to the front end JavaScript thingy. We will not go into details how these things work for this video, but rather it send it to the front end, and then do some actions on the browser, local storage, and so on, and then gets the feedback back in a promise. And then we need to change the state depending on this case. In this case, this is like an async change, and this is a valid way if it changes. Other than that, it's always you have to sync changes, like always doing it synchronously. There is no like promises or anything like that. So this is maybe like a very small point regarding the state on whether to use like async or sync. And it is a little bit critical because there is a very abusive way to use effect inside the front end. So whenever they would like to change the state, they would use effect with set state, use effect with set state, or watchers. Like you have many watchers listening on the current data or the current props or the current internal state of the component, and always listening on this change and then changing them. In this case, this is wrong. whenever you are just dealing with state inside your application, you always use sync because it's easier to debug and track. Also similar with the store, this is also synchronous. You don't use any async basically in most of the current frameworks or libraries that are using like state management. You always use sync changes and it's easier to track. But async is always, you think of it when you are dealing with something external like the DOM or like changing canvas or any DOM API basically. Most of the time it's an async change. Other than that, it's always sync. So that's for this video. Basically, it's a short video about how to manage the state, and in a future video, we'll discuss using this concept to build this application and examples of state management. Like there is Redux, there is Mobex. Also, it is a state management library. There is an Xstate, there is Recoil, and there is NGRX used by Angular. And inside each framework, there is a way to manage the global state or the local state. Like, for example, in React, there is context and there is use state. In Angular, there is an internal state for each class, and there is services, which are from the outside used for shared state. And in Vue as well, there is provide, inject, and there is data inside your single component. And each one of these libraries, they always have a way to manage the state, like either it's internal or external, and each part of these libraries basically they are plugged into each one of these frameworks or libraries. So in this case, you could have whatever state management system, and you would just like either write custom code for React or Angular or Vue, or there is a way to plug each one of them. So for example, in React you would have like Redux React, the libraries used to like plug Redux into React. Also similar with Mobex, you have like Mobex React as well. So each one is just like to glue each part of them. So that's all for this short video, and in a future video we will have like ideas on how to build like this application. We'll discuss how to build this application basically in a future video. So keep watching in the like upcoming videos, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you in future videos. Ciao.